Did you know that in the 1700s, a child born in Mexico could be legally classified as a wolf, a Chinese person, or someone who turns black? And none of these labels have anything to do with animals, Asia, or actually going anywhere. They were official terms invented by the Spanish and Portuguese empires to describe the ancestry of their own subject. This wasn't just a strange historical quirk, it was a desperate attempt to control the largest human mixing event the world have ever seen. Today, we are going to explore the incredible story of the African diaspora in Latin America. It is not just a tale of tragedy, but a story of how millions of people from a vast and diverse continent were brought together and how their descendants created entirely new identities, cultures, nations, and phenotypes. To understand this story, we have to go back to the beginning, to the source. The black people trafficked into Latin America by Spanish and Portuguese colonizers came from a vast area of Africa, with the overwhelming majority originating from two primary regions, West Africa and West Central Africa. This wasn't a single people from a single place. We are talking about a region spanning thousands of miles. The ethnic groups were incredibly diverse. Think of the Yoruba and Hausa peoples of modern-day Nigeria, the Ewe from Ghana and Togo, and the Congo and Bundu peoples from Angola and DRC. This wasn't one culture, it was a tapestry of countless cultures, phenotypes, languages, and spiritual traditions, all uprooted and thrown together in the New World. And the scale of this forced migration is staggering. Between 16th and 19th centuries, an estimated 10 to 12 million Africans were brought to the Americas against their will. But here's a fact that often surprises people. Of those millions, approximately 95% were sent to Latin America and the Caribbean. Only a tiny fraction, around 5%, was sent to what is now the United States. Brazil alone was the largest single importer, receiving about 35 to 40% of the total trade. That's around 4 million souls. The Spanish colonies in the rest of the continent received another 20%, about 2.5 million people. So when we talk about African diaspora in the New World, we are primarily talking about Latin America, as this was the epicenter. But before I continue discussing Afro-Latinos, I have an important announcement. This video is just scratching the surface of the story, but in my book, World Encyclopedia of African People, I dove much deeper, sharing their stories in the deep detail it deserves for every Afro-Latino community. But not only Afro-Latinos, but all Afro-derived people around the world, starting from Africa with the oldest to the youngest lineages, and their countless ethnic groups in between, and the mixed communities that emerged in the Middle Ages and colonial era, and together with its diaspora communities, not only in Latin America but the whole world. In each chapter, I explored their genetic and ancestral backgrounds, history and migrations, geographic distributions, phenotypic traits, languages and communications, traditional lifestyles and economies, cultural traits and customs, modern identity and diaspora, and much, much more. If you're curious about African people and its rich diversity, I personally wrote this book for you. The link and more details are in description. Thank you very much. Now let's continue with the video. Now, once these millions of people from different African nations arrived in this new world, they didn't just become a single homogeneous group. They landed in colonies run by the Spanish and Portuguese, who were just obsessed with racial purity as they were with gold, silver, and plunder. But unlike in North America, where the social line was often drawn simply between black and white, coupled by enforced racial endogamy, the Iberian colonies was different, in which there was heavy mixing between Iberians, Amerindians, and Africans because of their memory of being ruled by Arabs for over 9 centuries, by which they were already accustomed to a multiracial society. Plus, the European demography that was brought over to the New World was not families but soldiers, settlers, and desperados, who are more open to be in a mixed-race relationship, which created a complex, almost pseudo-scientific system to categorize everyone. This was the Sistema de Castas, or the caste system. It was an attempt to measure a person's social worth based on ancestry percentages, skin tone, and proximity to whiteness. But this system was not created by the people themselves. It was imposed by colonial authorities to control society, to turn human identity into something measurable, something fixed. But one of the most common identities that emerged was the mulatto, a person of mixed African and European ancestry, usually Spanish or Portuguese. Because European men greatly outnumbered women, this group grew rapidly. Mulattoes became widespread across Brazil, the Caribbean, and North and South America. They often lived in cities, worked as skilled laborers or artisans, and formed their own militias and religious brotherhoods. The term, though rooted in colonialism, is still used in many countries today as a common self-description, especially in Brazil and the Caribbean. Today, this population has produced a unique but very unstable phenotype due to ongoing mixing, a phenotype I would like to call the Afro-Iberid. It is a balanced mixture of Iberian Mediterranean phenotypes with minor Canarid and random mixtures between Congolid phenotype and Sudanid, with minor Malagacid. But the system didn't stop there. It became even more granular. The child of a mulatto and a Spaniard was called a Morisco, and then the child of a Morisco and a Spaniard is called an albino. Despite the name, this has nothing to do with albinism. It simply meant someone who appeared white despite African ancestry. Today, there are no communities who identify with such labels, as the majority are white passing and simply identify as Blanco, and they are found in Argentina, Chile, Paraguay, and southern Brazil. But this obsession with race got so extreme that they invented a term called torna atrás, which means turns back. This was used when two light-skinned parents had a child who appeared darker, revealing hidden African ancestry that the colonial logic thought should have been bred out. And then there was the mixing that happens between Africans and the indigenous peoples of the Americas. This produced another major group. The most common term for this in Spanish America was Zambo. In ancestry terms, a Zambo was considered roughly half African and half indigenous. These communities were especially common in Mexico, coastal Colombia, Panama, Peru, Ecuador, and parts of Central America. In Brazil, the equivalent term was Cafuzo. Because both Africans and indigenous peoples were pushed to the margins of the colonial societies, their communities often developed together in the frontier zones, forest, and river deltas. This blending created strong traditions of resistance and cultural survival. From the Zambo identity came even more subdivisions. The Lobo was sometimes used for someone with heavier indigenous ancestry. In Mexico and Peru, the term Chino, meaning Chinese, was used to describe people of African and indigenous ancestry, likely because of the texture of their hair, not their connection to Asia. However, this group produced unique phenotypes depending on the region. In Central America, we have the Afro-Centralid. It's a blend of Central Amerindian phenotypes from the Atlantic, such as Pueblid, Maya, and Ismid, and random mixtures between Congolid phenotypes and Sudanid with minor Malagacid. In Brazil, Colombia, and Venezuela, we have Afro-Amazonids. It is a blend of Amazonian Amerindian phenotypes such as Northern and Southern Amazonid, with random mixtures between mostly Congolid and Sudanid phenotypes with minor Malagacid. Now, as colonial rule weakened and independence movements swept across the continent in the 19th century, this rigid caste thinking began to soften. It was impossible to maintain such a complex system when the whole point of independence was to create new nations. People started using more flexible terms that focus less on exact ancestry percentages and more on appearance. The term pardo became incredibly important in Brazil. It simply means brown, and it refers to mulattoes and people of mixed African, European, and indigenous ancestries. It acknowledges mixture without trying to calculate it. Similarly, moreno became a widely used term across Spanish Latin America, and it is used to describe someone with African ancestry, who are mostly mixed between Africans and mestizos. In Puerto Rico and the Caribbean, you'll hear trigueño, meaning wheat-colored, used to describe olive or light brown skin tones. But demographically, this group of triracial Afro-Latinos are the majority population of Brazil and the Dominican Republic, and they produced a unique but unstable phenotype known as the pardid. It is a blend of indigenous Amazonid and Centralid phenotypes, Iberian Mediterranean phenotypes, and African Congolesid and Sudanid phenotypes. Though unstable, it varies from person to person. One family could have different looks depending on which genes decided to show which traits the most. But to truly understand the depth of African survival in Latin America, we have to look beyond the mixed population and towards the communities that retain the highest degrees of African ancestry. These are the Maroon communities, known by different names across the region: Palanques in Spanish America, Coelombos in Brazil, and Maroon societies throughout the Caribbean and the Guyanas. These were not just scattered individuals, but organized societies formed by escaped Africans who fled plantations and established their own free settlements deep in forest, mountains, and remote coastlines. The most famous of these is Palanques de Sao Basilio in Colombia, a village founded by escaped enslaved Africans led by Bencos Biojo in the 16th century, which still exists today and has preserved its own unique Spanish Creole languages, ritual practices, and social structure. In Brazil, the Coelombos were massive, with the most iconic being Coelombo des Palmares, a confederation of settlements that resisted Portuguese colonial forces for nearly a century, at its height housing thousands of Africans and indigenous people. Today, their descendants, the Coelombola communities, still live across rural Brazil, maintaining strong African cultural retentions in their music, religion, and agriculture. And they continue to fight for land rights and recognition. These communities are not just historical footnotes, they represent the most direct continuation of African ethnic identities in the Americas, with many preserving specific cultural elements traceable to the Congo, Yoruba, and their ancestral nations. Beyond the mainland, we find the Garifuna people, one of the most remarkable Afro-indigenous community in the hemisphere. Their origin story begins in the island of St. Vincent, where shipwrecked or escaped enslaved Africans intermixed with the indigenous island Carib people, creating a distinct culture and language. When the British forcibly removed them from the island in 1797, they were exiled to the Honduran coast. From there, they spread along the Caribbean shoreline of Belize, Guatemala, and Nicaragua. Today, the Garifuna are unique because they carry predominantly African ancestry, but speak an Arawak-based language with Carib and European influences, and they practice traditions recognized by UNESCO as a masterpiece of oral and intangible heritage of humanity. In the Caribbean, we have the Rizal people of San Andres and Providencia Islands off the coast of Colombia, an Afro-Caribbean population speaking San Andres Providencia Creole English, with deep roots in both African ancestry and Protestant traditions brought by British colonizers. Phenotypically, despite the Coelombos or the Brazilian Maroons, who are mostly either pardid or Afro-Amazonid, the rest of the Maroon communities throughout Spanish Latin America, some Coelombos of Brazil, Garifuna and Rizal communities all share a dominant Afro-derived phenotype known as Southwestern Africanid. It is a random blend of Congolid phenotypes together with Sudanid phenotypes, with minor Malagasid and Latin Amerindian phenotypes. So there you have it, guys. Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you want to dig deeper, check out my book where I discuss all Afro-Latino groups in details. And if you want to know another African diaspora video, check out my previous video. And as always, stay curious, stay smart, and thank you very much for watching.